Well, thank you again for this opportunity to participate in this conference. It was a blessing hearing the last presentation by Brother Andy. A deep blessing to my soul. I want to carry on in our reflections on Christian worldview. As a matter of fact, we haven't quite begun looking at the Christian worldview as yet. We've been laying something of a foundation. I hope to do some work on that tomorrow, God willing. Let me begin by reading a scripture as we did yesterday from Acts chapter 17, because what I will be handling is something of a continuation of that, even though narrowed down to the African worldview. Verse 22 of Acts chapter 17, I'll read on to verse 31. So Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Yet he is actually not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. Even some of your own poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. Being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of man. The times of ignorance God overlooked, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. And of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. Well, this afternoon here in Africa, morning out there in America, we'll be reflecting on the African worldview. Before we do that, just a brief recap of what we have covered thus far. On Monday, we considered the foundational questions of a worldview. I won't go through that. Yesterday, we considered the different types of worldviews that are represented around the world. We focused on worldviews such as theism, deism, pantheism, animism, naturalism, existentialism, nihilism, and postmodernism. We saw that there is a rationale for the arrangement that I have proposed here, and I'm not the only one who has done that. Others have thought similarly. Theism provides a foundational perspective, assuming a personal, transcendent God revealed to man from the beginning. In Genesis 1, we find God actively creating. And then as you progress through Genesis, that God who created then begins to reveal himself to man. He happens to have been the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. That is the God who has revealed himself to every true believer in Christ. That's the foundation. Deism, pantheism, and animism represent a gradual shift toward naturalistic explanations, diminishing the role of a transcendent God. Naturalism marks a turning point, focusing solely on the natural world and paving the way for existentialism. Existentialism emphasizes individual freedom. And it's important to note that this freedom is also a freedom from God. This is radicalized by nihilism, which denies any inherent value or purpose in life. It challenges the very foundations of morality and meaning and existence. Postmodernism, which is the world in which the Western world is living and very quickly creeping into other parts of the world, including Africa, it challenges the notion of objective truth. It has fragmented meaning and embraced subjective interpretations. We spent time reflecting on that yesterday. Well, today we want to continue looking at types of worldviews, and our focus will be on the African worldview, which we briefly touched on yesterday when we reflected on animism. And I wanted to single this out for obvious reasons. Most of the students here are Africans. And I must say that what I will say will probably sound very strange for our Western brothers, but it's also true to say that many Africans live under the influence of this worldview, but they don't really understand what it is. They can't really define it. And for that reason, this will be a useful reflection, even for the Africans. Now, I read Acts chapter 17, and in that context, Paul was addressing a people who were giving loyalty and allegiance to idols, to things that were not gods. And each of those idols, each of those religions represented in those idols was rooted in a worldview. And Paul noted that and seized the opportunity to introduce them to God and to introduce them to a biblical worldview. The African worldview is also called the African traditional religion. What is the African worldview? Well, we generally defined a worldview as the noetic structure we use to make sense of the world. If that is so, it follows that the African worldview is the noetic structure Africans use to make sense of the world. It is a noetic structure that is largely influenced by African traditional religion. And to understand the African worldview, therefore, we need to understand the African traditional religion. What is African traditional religion? African traditional religion is the indigenous religion of Africans, which has been handed over from generation to generation, usually by word of mouth. More and more these days, African beliefs are being written down, are being documented. So I imagine the spread will work even faster. The title, African Traditional Religion, sometimes simply called ATR, presents an assumed unitary portrait of the religions of the African. Although it is true that many features of the religion and its practice are similar across the continent of Africa, it would be erroneous to assume that all African religions are the same everywhere. They are not. Africa has a very large population, over 1 billion people. And there are different types of Africans, even though sometimes people elsewhere out of Africa don't think that's the case. There are different kinds of Africans, many, 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 many cultures. There isn't one African culture. There are many, many cultural expressions. So when we say African traditional religion, we don't mean to say all African religion is the same. The right label for the religions of Africa is African religions or African indigenous religions to reflect the plurality within the continent's religious landscape. Though Africa is a large continent, however, with diverse peoples and culture, it is correct to say there is a core of Africanness that runs through their cultures and religions. So different cultures, different religions, and yet you can trace a core of Africanness. And that is really what we'll be trying to trace here as we think about the African worldview. And I want us to look at the characteristics of African traditional religion. We will highlight 3 characteristics as suggested in the name African traditional religion. First, the religion is African. The religion is African. That means it was born and bred in Africa. It was brought about and nurtured by Africans. It may therefore be referred to as African indigenous religions. It is African. That is the first thing. Second, it is a religion. It is a religion. For that reason, it bears all the marks of a religion. And what are the marks of this religion? It has an organized system of beliefs. It has ceremonies, very often driven and fed by myths. It has rules used to worship God or gods. Much of Africa actually believes just in one God, but there are Africans who believe in more than one God. But most of Africa is monotheistic. It has a philosophy, even though there is a very big debate about whether Africa really has any philosophy. It has attitudes, it has practices, just like any other religion. It includes experience, such as dramatic encounters with what they consider to be the divine. And people elsewhere in the world speak about having had an encounter with God, having an encounter with the divine, an encounter which transforms their lives. Many Africans can lay claim to similar experiences. ATR is a religion. I want to zero down to the core beliefs and practices of ATR, since it has a belief set, which is why it's a worldview, of course. I'll just sample a few important beliefs, core beliefs. And we begin with what is known as the hierarchy of spiritual powers. The hierarchy of spiritual powers. The hierarchy of spiritual powers first has right at the top of that hierarchy the supreme being, what they would refer as God. This God, it must be pointed out, is not a trinity of persons in the Godhead. He is one person, omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent. An important emphasis to make is that he is transcendent in the sense of being so highly lifted and removed from his creatures that people can't relate to him. People can't relate to him. They don't relate to God. God doesn't relate to him. So Africans can't tell you that they have a personal relationship with God, the supreme being. The supreme being is followed by the divinities. Now, because he is a transcendent God, far removed from his creatures, he works through divinities. So these are lesser gods, and not every African traditional religion believes this, by the way, but some do, especially in the western part of Africa, that there are divinities in a manner similar to the way the Greeks had mythical divinities, a pantheon of gods who are responsible for all kinds of things, god of the sea, a god of the land, a god of fertility, a god of marriage, etc., etc. So in Africa, in some cultures, they would believe in divinities. And it's very convenient to have divinities because if you can't relate to God, you can at least relate to these lesser gods who are more than adequate in terms of taking care of your needs. Below the divinities are the spirits. And at this level, very similar to Christianity, they believe in both angels and demons, benevolent spirits as well as malevolent spirits. And then below the spirits, we have the ancestral spirits. I'll be telling you a little bit about these as we go along. The ancestral spirits. These are human spirits, spirits of men who once lived. They're now dead, but they continue to be an important part of the community. So this is the hierarchy of spiritual powers. Second, under the core beliefs, we have the hierarchy of matter. And that consists in man, who comes in the fifth place, animals, different kinds of animals, the whole animal kingdom, and then plants and the rest of the physical world. That will include mountains and rivers, everything. That's the hierarchy of matter. Now, between the hierarchy of spirits and the hierarchy of matter, there is an ontological divide. It's It's an indivisible divide. And I'm sorry, an invisible divide. The spirits are up there, matter is down here. And there is a divide which ordinarily cannot be crossed. It is crossed, but ordinarily it cannot be crossed. I will share with you how exactly it is crossed. These hierarchies, the hierarchy of spiritual powers and the hierarchy of matter, suggests that because the spirits are higher above the ontological divide, they have higher influence, higher power over those that are below. That notwithstanding, there is a physical and spiritual relationship between them. Let me narrow down to some key players in the hierarchy, beginning with the supreme being. And he is called by all kinds of names in Africa. But basically, the supreme being is God. The supreme being creates all the physical and spiritual worlds. So Africans are creationists. They are not evolutionists or anything else. They are creationists. You will rarely find atheists in Africa. And most atheists are educated in the West. Most Africans believe in God, and they believe that God created all the physical and spiritual worlds. Not only that, the supreme being imbues the cosmos with a vital force to sustain all of life. It's a little bit like what Paul describes here about God. In him we live and move and have our being. We can't move without God. We can't live without God. We can't have our being without God. Africans believe something of that. The supreme being fills the cosmos and everything with it, with a vital force that sustains all of life. Now, we may not describe that sustenance in exactly the same way as Christians do it, but the idea is similar. In addition to that, we have the spirits, the other spirits, apart from the spirit, the supreme being, who are key players. The spirits, and that includes the divinities, the demons, the angels, the ancestral spirits, have some control over the physical phenomena. Physical phenomena includes man, of course. And they don't just have this invisible control over them. Sometimes they inhabit them, which is why ATR is sometimes described as being animistic, because the belief is that behind every physical phenomena lies a spirit power, a spirit force. So you will find this force on man, you will find this force on animals, on plants, on rivers, mountains. Africans don't just see the physical force, they see spiritual power behind those physical forces. And then another key player in the hierarchy is man. Man. And as we point that out, it needs to be stressed that the African man has a sense that there is a lively metaphysical activity going on around them. And this activity consists in spirits. What we see is not all that there is. Physical illness is not just caused by viruses and bacteria and other microorganisms. There is always a spirit power behind those illnesses. So for Africans, spirit and material beings form an intricate nexus of reality. Furthermore, man who feels the effects of spiritual beings sometimes actually labors to manipulate these spiritual beings. Now, if you look at the hierarchy, man is somewhere in the middle. He has spiritual forces above him. He has some matter below him. But man is a special being, even in the African mindset. And he sometimes manipulates the forces that are above him, the spiritual forces. He manipulates them to his advantage. Sometimes he does so to harm others. Now, to understand how this works, we need to have some appreciation for what is known as the doctrine of limited cosmic good. The doctrine of limited cosmic good. The doctrine amounts to teaching the following: that there is only a limited amount of good, and by good is meant life, good luck, prestige, influence, children, possessions, all manner of wealth, all of that is good. There's only a limited amount of good in the cosmos. Each person is allotted a fixed quantity of this good. This good can only be increased at the expense of someone else, because everyone lives in this closed circle. And you can't leave the circle to go and improve your lot. You must basically remain content with what you have been given by the Supreme Being. So if you want to increase the good, it has to be done at the expense of someone else. And to be able to get it off someone else, you use black magic, you use theft or ritual murders. I'll come back to that, but let me also talk about vital force, closely related to the idea of the limited good is the concept of vital force. And vital force is the ability to manipulate spiritual and non-spiritual forces. So vital force basically consists in magic and in witchcraft, in sorcery. So people desire vital force to gain good, to improve their lot. Hard work is not the means through which cosmic good may be increased. Investment is not the means through which cosmic good may be increased. Vital force is what most people desire. Magic. That is why Africans falls very much for the faith charismatic movement, because it promises easy wealth, easy prosperity. It promises magical ways of becoming wealthy. Those ways, of course, are clothed in the name of Christianity, but it's not Christianity, and Africans find that very appealing. The decrease of vital force is the greatest fear for most people. So here is an illustration of the working of vital force. And I want you to imagine you are in this closed circle, this world. You are a member of that world. The Supreme Being has put everyone in that world, and the Supreme Being himself is part of that circle. So person A in the cosmos, a closed circle, has a certain amount of good. Person B, who lives in the same cosmos, also has the same amount of good. Person B wishes to increase his good. He can't do it from outside the cosmos because there is no one outside that cosmos. He can't do it from outside the cosmos. Person B can only increase his good at the expense of person A. To get person A's good, he needs to use his vital force. Now, he can use, here in Zambia, in some tribes, we would call it Ilomba. Now, this is a physical, spiritual snake with a human head. Can you imagine that? A snake with a human head. It's physical, it's also a spiritual being. And it has the ability to go through physical buildings and the ability to steal anything from anyone. And people obtain this through witchcraft. So person A could use a means like that to access to person B. I meant to say person B. To access person A's goods, he could use the thing like that. Now, person A does not wish to lose his goods. So he also employs his vital force to protect himself. So people are using vital force to steal from others using witchcraft. Others are using vital force to protect themselves from losing the only good they have. They're all using witchcraft, magic. So in the African context, witchcraft is not always viewed negatively. It is, but it's not always viewed that way. Magic is not always viewed negatively because people can use it to protect themselves. So it becomes a good. Another important key player in the hierarchy are the ancestral spirits. Ancestral spirits are dead relatives. They once lived, they played an important role, they were alive. They are now dead, and they have transitioned to the spiritual side of the community. So they are often referred to as the living dead. The living dead. Now, followers of ATR believe that ancestors, these are dead ones, of course, maintain a spiritual connection with their living relatives. And where ATR is being closely followed, if, for example, you lived in Kampala, but you come from some remote place in Uganda, your village is out there, and you die in Kampala, many who are consistent with ATR will not be buried in Kampala. They will be taken back to the village because that is where everyone is. That is where the community of ancestors lives. They are on the spiritual side of that community, and that's where they live. And in order for them to join that company of ancestors, they have to be buried in a particular way. So there are very complicated rituals sometimes that need to be practiced in order to bury a person properly and to transition them properly onto those ancestral spiritual communities. And the living are very conscious of the presence of these ancestors. They keep them in their memory, and sometimes they can live in those memories for many, many years. Ancestors are present in terms of wielding authority. They're present in time and space. They have power, and people are familiar with them. Most ancestral spirits are deemed to be good and kind. Others, perhaps not so kind. Usually they are deemed to be good. The only negative actions they tend to take is to inflict illnesses on people to warn them, especially when they have gotten onto wrong paths. And sometimes the ancestors can punish a community for going the wrong way. And ancestors are said to bring famines and to bring about droughts and illnesses as a way of punishing the community. And to placate the anger of these spirits, the community is encouraged to bring all manner of sacrifices to them. The offerings could be beer, meat. They especially like taking white chickens to them. And to please them, people revere them because obviously they once lived well. They're now in the community of ancestral spirits. They provide, they protect. So people revere them and invoke them and invoke their name and labor to please them. Sometimes families, when they have newly born children, will not just give them names. The elders need to go and consult the spirits, and the spirits will give them a name, and then they will organize a name giving ceremony and announce the name that will have been proposed by the ancestral spirits. Now, sometimes this kind of thing is referred to as ancestral worship, even though many Africans prefer not to call it worship. They believe that they only worship the one God. And the other divinities, including ancestral spirits, are merely medias through which they connect with God. It's a bit like Roman Catholicism. They have all kinds of saints, including Mary, that they pray through. And Catholics will tell you that they don't worship those things, they only worship God. Well, Africans have a similar argument. When you look at what they do in reality, it does look like worship. Okay, there are other key players in the hierarchy that come in the form of man. You have diviners, you have doctors. The diviners are there to diagnose a problem. When you fall sick, you can go to one of these people and they will tell you what is wrong. Doctors are there to prescribe remedies. And believe it or not, they have a knowledge of trees and herbs and all kinds of things. And they are able to prescribe medication. Some of the prescription is of a spiritual nature. You have mediums who connect people to their living dead. You have witches and sorcerers who practice black magic, which is meant to inflict disruption and imbalance on the community. These are selfish ends when people are trying to cause harm. They have prophets who call people to do what is right, priests who exercise authority in the realm of ritual and symbolic action. You can see this is an organized religion. They may not meet in buildings, in churches like Christians do, but they do worship. They do gather around as families usually. They gather under trees, and sometimes they have a shrine in their homes, and they call these priests to those places, and they play their roles in that way. Now, these diviners are really diviners and mediums and prophets are the means through which the ontological divide that I spoke about is crossed. People don't just speak to spirits. They go to one of these mediums and they communicate the message to the spirits through these mediums. There's one more thing I needed to say before we head toward a close. I said African traditional religion is African. It is a religion, but it's also a tradition. ATR is based on oral tradition, which means that the basic values, the way of life, are passed from elders to younger generation, which is what every culture does. But they do it through stories and myths and tales. And stories are very, very important. And it's through stories that adults teach children the ways of life. They warn them, they counsel them. So Africans are natural storytellers. Even those who are saved and they are Christians and are preachers, if they are not well instructed, much of what they do is tell stories. And they can be very gripping stories. So these traditions are passed from one generation to the next. And the elders are the ones who pass on these traditions. They are the final authority, and they are trusted completely. They are trusted completely. Now time to talk about another core belief, which is community. Community. Africans hold to what is known as a communal view of man. ATR promotes this. Now, this view is captured in the dictum by this African theologian called John Mbiti, died a few years ago. It says, I am because we are. And because we are, I am. I am because we are. And because we are, I am. This basically defines and describes communalism as viewed by Africans. It's a philosophical piece. But what does it mean? First, it means that man is not an individual, That is, he doesn't live in a state of independence. Man is communal. That is to say, he lives in a state of relationships. He lives in a state of interdependency. This is the exact opposite of individualism, which is more prominent in a Western cultural context. Man is communal. He is a relational being, an interdependent being. Secondly, it means that man as an individual does not live in terms of himself. Man does not claim personal rights and freedoms. He is there to fulfill communal obligations and duties. Now, it is why sometimes when the West is throwing the whole idea of rights upon Africans, personal rights, individual rights, and so on. And of course, there is a place for rights, isn't there? Natural rights, especially as given of God, there's a place for that. But your normal African doesn't really relate to this idea of personal rights and freedoms. He is communal in his thinking. He thinks in terms of communal rights and obligations and duties. The dictum also means man becomes a person or an adult in the process of becoming a member of a community. So if you are an individual and you're not connected to the community, you are individualistic, most people don't think much of you. Most people think you haven't grown up yet. You haven't matured yet. You mature in the process of becoming a member of the community, carrying out its obligations and duties. There are some implications arising from that communalism. Of course, humanity is emphasized. A brother asked if there was anything positive about especially ATR, African Worldview, and I spoke about the philosophy of Ubuntu. Ubuntu simply means being humane. Umuntu means human. Being humane means Ubuntu. So helping each other, working together, being united, promoting each other's goods, assisting each other. That is quite common in African communities. So humanity is emphasized. And that is a positive, certainly. If you look at the picture of the early church, you find this kind of picture, the people of God working together, working for each other, promoting each other's goods, etc., etc. And that is what African communalism aims for, being hospitable to each other, helping strangers, etc. But there is a downside to this, and I'll be saying a little more on that as we go along. Because of this emphasis on communalism, individual initiative is not appreciated. People with a Western cultural outlook will emphasize individual initiative, which is a good thing. Individualism is a bad thing. But being an individual and having an individual initiative in itself is not a bad thing. Communalism can tend to throw away individual initiative. And communalism takes priority. Egalitarianism is prized when an individual is progressing because maybe they are working hard. They have wisdom, they have a business acumen, and they're doing well. They can easily be treated with suspicion. They can be viewed as being somewhat selfish because they are not working for the community, they are promoting themselves. And people can easily work towards bringing this person down so that he can be like everyone else. Because communalism for many looks like egalitarianism. And it's for this reason that you find that Africans easily warm up to communism and Marxism, cultural Marxism. Those are things that easily lend themselves to African support because they are very close to the way Africans think about community. All right, we don't have much time, so I'll run through this section quickly before I come to a close. Philosophical elements of the African worldview. In other words, how they view metaphysics, epistemology, axiology, eschatology. This will be quick. African metaphysics is the African's perception of reality. And as indicated earlier on, Africans have the sense that there is a lively metaphysical activity going on around them. In other words, they are conscious of spirits wielding influence on physical phenomena. Now, as I was reading Acts chapter 17, there's something of this. There are different meanings, of course. But when Paul says to the Athenians that in God we live and move and have our being, the Greeks could clearly relate to that. They had this consciousness of the presence of these gods that they imagined and to whom they erected altars. And Paul introduces them to a God in whom they live and move and have their being. Almost as if you are saying, you must understand this God. You must be conscious of this God. Don't worry about all the other. Be conscious of this God. Africans have a consciousness of spirits. They really should be focusing on God and not on all the spirits that worry them. They have this God consciousness about them. Unfortunately, it's not really the true God, the biblical God. What about epistemology, Afro-epistemology, as I call it? And in African worldview, knowledge is the understanding of the nature of forces and their cosmic interaction. It's the understanding of that hierarchy of forces that we spoke about. So true wisdom and knowledge lies in what Placide Temple, this man was a missionary in Congo for many years. He's written quite a bit on African philosophy. He says the true wisdom or knowledge in Africa lies in ontological knowledge. It is the intelligence of forces, of their hierarchy, their cohesion, and their interaction. So you may be a very learned person in the ways of the world today, but if you have no understanding of spirits, and what they might be doing to physical phenomena, Africans don't think much of it. To be seen as a knowledgeable and wise person, you must have insight into the world of spirit. What about ethics, axiology, Afro-axiology? Man's morality, man's ethics, and accountability are understood in terms of his relationships within the community. So how is sin defined? Sin is defined as a broken relationship between persons, usually persons of the same group. If you go contrary to the will of the community or the desire of the community or the intentions of the community, that is what sin is. It's not sin as breaking the law of God, as our brother was reminding us earlier on. It is breaking the law of the community, not pleasing the community. That is what sin is. Righteousness, on the other hand, is living in sync with the community. Forgive the typo there. Sync is misspelled. Righteousness is living in sync with the community. What about aesthetics? There's such a thing as aesthetic value. Africans value beauty. They appreciate the beauty of nature. They work to improve that as well. Generally speaking, you could say that aesthetic value is not as advanced and sophisticated as other cultures. Beauty is appreciated, but you can see quite a bit of ugliness in African aesthetics, African architecture, African surroundings. There is a lack of order, of symmetry, of cleanliness in many places. It doesn't mean Africans don't appreciate beauty. When they go to beautiful places, like some places are in the Western world, a lot of them don't come back because they want to stay in beautiful places. And one wishes they could come back to actually help beautify Africa, help organize Africa, help make it the kind of place that other people would want to come to. What about eschatology? A biblical theology of death and life after death in the context of Africa today can never be done in isolation from ATR. Generally speaking, there are no rewards or punishments in the life after death, nor is there any hope of fellowship with a God. There is no possibility of change and transformation in the next life. Instead, the ultimate destiny is basically forgotten, gradually slipping back into the unknown. That doesn't mean Africans don't have an eschatology. They have what can be called the cyclical view of eschatology. It's a bit like reincarnation. We have a life, we live the best way we can, serving the supreme God through the divinities, etc., and serving the community. We die. And when we die, depending on how we live this side of eternity, we can take our place among the ancestral spirits. And we can live again. How do they live again? Well, when a child is born, And the elders go to consult these spirits about names and so on. The spirits suggest a name. Normally, it would be the name of somebody who has passed on and is probably among the ancestral spirits. So when the person is given the name, that ancestral spirit is said to be translated from the spirit world back into the body of this baby who has been named after that spirit. That spirit then begins to live, and the baby is expected to display the characteristics of the spirit that has come to live in them. And so because so many people are dying and so many people are being born, the dying are coming back to life through those that are being born. So that's the cyclical view of eschatology. So I want to end with a number of questions, and there's a lot I could say still. I won't have time to do that. Why must we as Christians engage in a study of African traditional religion? Why must we as African Christians study this? Well, like I said, we can't make a distinction between African traditional religion, African culture, African worldview. They are one and the same thing. I think it is true to say that all worldviews are like that. Religion lies at the heart of our worldviews, or whatever they might be. And so if we must understand our worldview, we need to understand the religion in which it is rooted. It's also important to note that there's been a growing influence of African traditional religion on African Christianity. We are seeing that even Christians are living in fear of a world of spirits and spells and omens. They've been saved by Christ. The Spirit of God lives in them, but somehow they still believe spirits can possess them and spirits can mess up their lives. And they then have to turn to prophets who equate witch doctors for deliverance, as if to say the deliverance they have received from Christ is not enough. So they need to go to this man who is specialized in exorcising demons and freeing people who are somewhat oppressed, and only such people will deliver them. And this is the sort of thing we are seeing quite a lot on the African continent. And this can be very confusing to those who are African and are sincerely seeking to be true to the Bible and to be Christ-centered. To understand the African context or culture, we need to understand ATR. To understand our worldview, we need to understand ATR. They are two sides of the same coin. So because ATR shapes the African worldview, it basically shapes the African way of looking at life, at individual life, at family life, at marriage, at work, development, etc., etc. So this is why we need to understand it. I want to end with some quotes, some comments on the influence of African worldview. These are quotes by various people. The same quote, the first quote is by a man called Gaiman. He's written a very interesting book called Who Are the Living Dead? Richard Gaiman. He says the whole plan looks to their living dead for guidance. Now, can you imagine? The problem lies right there. You are looking for your living dead for guidance. The direction of the people is turned back to the traditions of the ancestors. past is the focus of concern. John Mbiti, the African theologian, states that Africans have a past orientation. Because of this focus, there is a reluctance to innovate and to change direction. They're always looking in the past, always looking to ancestors. Sometimes it's to ancestors who did not achieve anything. And those are supposed to be the guides. Miller says there is no messianic hope, no concept of progress, no place for development. The golden age is always in the past, never in the future. Quite a difference from the West. Recourse to medicine men. Someone has a very serious illness and they don't trust modern medicine. They trust their ancestors more than modern medicine. And so they never make progress in terms of conquering disease. This is a quotation from an African, Nyamati. Recourse to the medicine man, ascribing ill luck to the will of ancestors and spirits. All these are hardly favorable to scientific progress, but result rather in cultural backwardness and resistance to change. There is much more I can say, but let me hurry on to the need, therefore, for a paradigm shift. There are good things in African culture and in the African worldview, certainly. But we need to adopt a Christian worldview. And I want to stress this. The West is very successful, not because that's the culture of the white man. I want to suggest it's because of the influence of Christianity on that culture. It's because of the influence of Christianity on Western civilization. That is what is responsible for the progress. It's got nothing to do with race. It's got everything to do with God. It's got everything to do with the Bible, the principles of the Bible, which Western culture has used ever so well, and unfortunately, very fast turning their back on these days. Vishal Mangawaldi is an Indian Christian philosopher. He's written a book called The Book That Made Your World. The Book That Made Your World. And it's addressed to the West. And Vishal basically argues that the West is successful, has been successful because of the Bible. The West will fall because the West is turning away from the Bible. If we must succeed as Africans, we must go to the Bible. We must go to the God of the Bible. We must go to the Savior of the Bible, the Savior of the Bible, Jesus Christ. And an encounter with him is transformative. It will transform us as individuals, it will transform our culture, it will transform everything. And we who are preachers, this is what we must preach. If we have any hope of seeing God-honoring transformation, we need to make a paradigm shift. We must adopt the Christian worldview. And so tomorrow I hope to commit some time to introducing the Christian worldview, answering foundational questions about it. Thank you.